This was just when Boris Johnson came in, so a few months before the day we're talking about. And he said during that meeting, 3 things are going to happen in the next few months. We're going to have a general election, we're going to win a massive majority, and we're going to get Brexit done. And I thought he was completely mad. I just thought, what planet is this guy on? None of those things is going to happen. I'd just been through the very bruising last 2 years of Theresa May, and he was 100% right and I was 100% wrong.
We're in the 30th of October. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is facing Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition. The previous day, Parliament had finally voted to hold a general election on December the 12th. That meant, with Parliament due to be dissolved the following Thursday, it would be the final PMQs for the outgoing Speaker, John Bercow, as well as scores of MPs either standing down or about to lose their seats. And on the front page of that day's Times, the headline, well, doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. December the 12th poll will get Brexit done, says Johnson. And he'd won the previous day support for a snap election by 438 votes to 20 after months and months of Brexit deadlock. Well, Peter Cardwell from Talk TV, you were there at the time. You're with me in the studio now, but at the time you were working as a government special advisor. And I think you might find this item quite triggering now.
I've worked through all of this in therapy, Patrick, and yes, bringing it all back. The PTSD is continuing. No, I mean, I say that flippantly, but it is sort of, there's so many things that I haven't thought about and listened to since then. But actually, if I could take you back just a little bit further, if that's okay, just a couple of months to a meeting. It was my first meeting I had. I was a special advisor for 3.5 years, including in the transition. I was one of the few that survived the May administration and went into the Johnson administration for 6 months, and then Dominic Cummings sacked me. But literally, the Monday morning, I don't know if you remember the 7:55 a.m. meeting that Dominic Cummings held for all special advisors. This was just when Boris Johnson came in, so a few months before the day we're talking about. And he said during that meeting, 3 things are going to happen in the next few months. We're going to have a general election, we're going to win a massive majority, and we're going to get Brexit done. And I thought he was completely mad. I just thought, what planet is this guy on? None of those things is going to happen. I'd just been through the very bruising last 2 years of Theresa May, and he was 100% right and I was 100% wrong.
So and that's why he's got a Substack, Peter, and you haven't.
That's right. I mean, I could be sitting in a basement in my PJs writing a Substack, but instead I'm here on Times Radio. So, no, it's fascinating thinking back to that time and all the emotions that were there.
Well, Gitto Harry, who joins us now, later worked as Director of Communications at Number 10 under Boris Johnson. But you'll remember this period well, Gitto, and just how much Boris Johnson was enjoying himself by this point.
He certainly was. That was very lively PMQs. And I think having witnessed the campaign that's underway at the moment for a week, we are lacking that sort of spontaneity, that wit, that wisdom, frankly, expressed, laced heavily with wit. But yes, I never liked Dom Cummings. I think he's one of the most odious people who've been in public life and one of the most destructive. But there was a huge sense of direction and of momentum and of mission in that period, I think, where they were heading towards a general election and for a little bit afterwards. And I've got to give them that. And he was part of that.
Right, let's head to the House of Commons then. After outlining his engagements for the day, Boris Johnson began by paying tribute to the departing Speaker, John Bercow.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in recording that after 10 tumultuous years, this is your last Prime Minister's questions. And as befits a distinguished former Wimbledon competitor, you have sat up there in your high chair, and not just as an umpire, ruthlessly adjudicating on the finer points of parliamentary procedure with your trademark Tony Montana scowl, Mr. Speaker. Not just as a commentator, offering your own opinions on the rallies you are watching, sometimes acerbic and sometimes kindly, but above all as a player in your own right, peppering every part of the chamber with your own thoughts and opinions, like some tennis ball machine, some uncontrollable tennis ball machine, Mr. Speaker, delivering a series of literally unplayable, unreturnable, formally unreturnable volleys and smashes. And although we may disagree about some of the legislative innovations that you have favoured, there is no doubt in my mind that you have been a great servant of this Parliament and of this House of Commons. You have modernised, you have widened access, you have cared for the needs of those with disabilities, and you have cared so deeply for the rights of backbenchers that you've done more than anyone since Stephen Hawking to stretch time in this particular session. And as we come to the end of what must be the longest retirement since Frank Sinatra, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in thanking you and hoping that you enjoy in your retirement the soothing medicament that you have so often prescribed for the rest of us.
Well, Peter Cardwell, I mean, that was all very good-humoured and warm, but Boris Johnson, you've got to give him credit, packed so many insults as to John Bercow's style and constitutional freestyling there in the space of a minute and 45 seconds.
That was vintage Boris Johnson, although there is a little bit of sick in my mouth because he was nice to John Bercow at one point, and John Bercow is just, I mean, speaking, good who Harry said, Dominic Cummings is the most odious person in politics. I think we can save that epithet for the bully, John Bercow, who's horrendous. He was awful to his staff. He was a dreadful speaker, and he deserved absolutely no tribute whatsoever.
Would you agree with that, Gitto?
He deserved a tribute for his role, basically, and though towards the end he became controversial for a number of reasons, and there were very serious allegations against him personally,
which were proven.
Yeah. So I can share the distaste, but it was it was a decade at the helm, if you like, or as the umpire of the House of Commons, and therefore I think it seemed appropriate at the time.
And take us into. You'll have helped Boris prepare for PMQs later on in his premiership, Gitto. But, when Boris Johnson gives a speech like that, I imagine the role of an advisor in that sort of circumstance is basically redundant. Is that all sort of extemporised by Boris? Is that all out of Boris's head at the time? Nobody's scripting that. He's just getting to the dispatch box and coming up with those elaborate metaphors and literary allusions himself, I imagine.
He thinks about these things an awful lot, and he would have researched and maybe asked people to research a little bit. So the link with John Bercow having been a Wimbledon competitor, which would have eluded most people, would have been the starting point. And then what he always used to refer to was the riff. He has to find that riff. And in another life, if he hadn't been Boris Johnson, he'd have liked to have been, the man who came up with bam, bam, ba-dam, bam. He'd have liked to have been Keith Harris. So he thinks in terms of riff. And the truth is, and it may shock some of the audience, that most politicians do not write their own speeches. They don't come up with their own lines. Boris takes a little bit of help, but most of it, and certainly the bits that are memorable, come from that brain of his, and he thinks about it for a long, long time, and then sort of downloads it. And he can spend hours thinking of something, but the moment it's in his head, it's a sort of download, and he can write extremely fast. And that was 90% him, I'd have thought.
Wow, really interesting. Right, shortly afterwards, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn also thanked John Bercow for his 10 years as Speaker. I don't think we need to listen to that. So let's head back to the Commons for Jeremy Corbyn's first question to Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's planned sell-out deal with Donald Trump means yet more National Health Service money being siphoned off into private profit. Channel 4 dispatches reported that the cost of drugs and medicines has repeatedly been discussed between US and UK trade representatives. Why did the Prime Minister previously say the health service wasn't on the table in any post-Brexit trade deal?
Mr. Speaker, the answer to that is very simple. It's because it is not on the table. And I pay tribute. And by the way, I pay tribute to the officials of the NHS who have just done a brilliant job in reducing the cost of Orkambi so that cystic fibrosis, made in America, by the way, so that cystic fibrosis sufferers in this country get the treatment they need at a cost that is reasonable to the taxpayers of this country. And if he wants to know how the people of this country are able to afford the stupendous investments that we're now making in the NHS, £34 billion, the biggest ever investment in the NHS, 40 new hospitals that we are building as a result of the decisions that we are taking. It is because this is the party that supports wealth creation. And the reason we're able to invest in the NHS, Mr. Speaker, is that for the last 9 years, this economy has been growing. It has grown by 19% since the Conservatives first came into office. And he would ruin this economy and ruin our ability to fund the NHS. And that is the reality.
Well, Peter, there was a lot in there.
Yeah.
I'm struck listening back to Jeremy Corbyn talk about Donald Trump and Brexit sellout deals and Donald Trump wanting to buy the NHS. That was really the dog that didn't bark in that election campaign, wasn't it? You know, Donald Trump did his interview on LBC. Labour got those documents, which may well, it turned out, have been procured by a Russian hack, saying that the NHS was going to be up for sale in the US trade deal. But that didn't shift the dial at all, did it?
It really didn't. It didn't take off as an idea. It was put around a lot by Jeremy Corbyn. He talked a lot about it at the time, and really it just didn't gain traction, as you correctly say, Patrick. It's fascinating thinking back to that growth, to the economy being in a much better state. So much has happened. I mean, decades kind of have happened in the last 4.5 years, and so much has changed since then with the COVID lockdowns and so many other things as well, and so many prime ministers as well. And could I just say a little bit about the personal dynamics as well,
absolutely.
actually, between, I mean, it's interesting when you look at Sunak and Starmer now. I mean, there's a sort of healthy contempt, there's a competitiveness, but I don't think they, if you sort of, sat them down, shone a light in their eyes, I don't think they actually hate each other. Whereas I really, really think that Jeremy Corbyn hated Boris Johnson. There was a strong personal contempt there, and Boris Johnson was just so dismissive towards Corbyn. And I'd kind of forgotten that dynamic, actually, in PMQs and in their relationship. And that's fascinating to kind of be reminded of it, even though it's only a few years ago.
Would you say that was mutual, Gitto, or is it a case of, Boris pitying or holding Jeremy Corbyn's politics in contempt? Would you have described it as hate between the two of them?
In general, he doesn't hate people. He doesn't even hate people who've treated him badly. He's very, very forgiving. That's kind of weird. And I think with Jeremy Corbyn, he would just think that his politics were so ludicrous and would be so bad for Britain that there's no need to hate him as a human being. I think in a weird way, he did have something way more personal and a sense of contempt towards Keir Starmer. And I think if he was leading this campaign now, as of course many candidates wished he were, there would be an edge to it that is lacking. There would be a sort of spontaneity, there would be a rigor, and there would be a real element of genuine nastiness, because Boris, he accused him of being complacent about, a couple of very, very serious crimes that took place when he was in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service. And some of the contempt that he felt towards him was deeply personal on that. And I remember him saying, when he survived the first attempt to bring him down with the vote of no confidence, he said, "We'll get through the summer and then we're going to punch that bruise. We're going to punch that bruise on Keir Starmer's arm over and over and over again until he's been pummeled into defeat in the general election."
Right. Well, let's hear Jeremy Corbyn's second question to Boris Johnson now.
Mr. Speaker, we all welcome the fact that a Camby will now be able to be provided in this country under the NHS, and we thank those that campaigned for it. The shame is that we're not told what the deal is with the company concerned. And as for these fabled 40 hospitals, that figure dropped to 20 and then finally dropped to 6. Mr. Speaker, we learned this week that government officials have met US pharmaceutical companies 5 times as part of the Prime Minister's planned trade detail. The US has called for full market access to our NHS, which would mean prices of some of our most important medicines increasing by up to 7-fold. Mr. Speaker, whilst the government is having secret meetings with US corporations, it's patients here that continue to suffer. Can the Prime Minister explain why the number of people waiting longer for urgent cancer treatment has tripled over the last 9 years?
Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, this government is investing £34 billion into the NHS. We are seeing improvements in cancer survival rates across the country. We are seeing improvements in cancer survival rates thanks to the investments that this government is making. And I think it's absolutely satirical Mr. Speaker, that he should claim credit for getting Orkambi and other drugs delivered at a reasonable price. That is the work of the UK government. That is the work of the NHS supporting NICE to ensure that people in this country get affordable treatments. And he may not be aware of it, Mr. Speaker, but the Vertex, the company that makes Orkambi, comes from America. Is he seriously suggesting that the NHS should not engage in negotiations to ensure that British patients get the drugs they deserve? Is he so phobic? Is he so phobic of American companies that he would forbid them for having those discussions?
Gitto, the NHS was obviously a big issue in this campaign. And over the course of these two questions, you hear Boris Johnson return time and again to investment in the NHS, the 40 new hospitals. It was a key plank of the Tory campaign. And listening to it now compared to what we've heard from the Tories of late under Rishi Sunak, he's much more confident on that turf than his successors have been, isn't he?
Yeah, and there were promises on hospitals, there were promises on police numbers, I think another 20,000, which was achieved actually before Boris was toppled. There were promises on a number of things, and having worked for him at the mayoralty as well, he always thought that the best way of dealing with issues of trust, which, far greater for him in number 10, but the same sort of principle, if you like, that applies to every politician, is to actually say what you would do if you're elected and then look back at the next election and point to what you achieved. And so what he would have been hoping for, and of course nobody could predict a global pandemic nor indeed war in Ukraine, but if he had gone through with the parliament he expected to lead, he would have looked back and said, we told you we'd get Brexit done, and we did within a few months. Then we told you that we would have 40 new hospitals, and he'd be visiting each one of them. And so it would be much more tightly linked to what people had been told to expect, and indeed, dare I say, the bread and butter issues of their daily lives at the moment. Do they feel safe on the streets? There are more police on the streets, would have been the answer from Boris. Do they feel the waiting lists are coming down? If we hadn't had the global pandemic, more hospitals in place, the NHS would be in far better shape. And so there's a sense of deep sadness, I think, listening to that, at the price that we've all paid and the things we've missed out on because of the pandemic.
I mean, and say what you like about Boris Johnson, Peter, he divides opinion. But listening back, as Gitto says, you can't dispute that in that phase of his leadership, and for much else of it, his messaging was ruthlessly focused on the voters.
Yes,
the Tories needed to win.
Well, this is the thing that with Boris Johnson that Gitto knows far better than I do, but is apparent to anybody who watches politics, which is that Boris Johnson is a fantastic campaigner. He connects with people, and the substance of that answer was essentially, hold on a second, are you honestly saying that we shouldn't try to get the best deal for patients? There are so many people like me who will be basically a socialist when it comes to the NHS, for universal healthcare, for it being free at the point of use, who will also say, well, yes, of course we've got to get the best deal on drugs. And Boris Johnson at this point was master of all he surveyed. He was going into an election, he was pretty sure he was going to win, and he did incredibly well. And that is, Boris Johnson was at that stage an absolute winner. And the fact is that Jeremy Corbyn couldn't really attack him successfully on Brexit. And then there was we've criticised Dominic Cummings previously in this, but he was part of the campaign that came up with one of the best 3-word phrases, not take back control, but actually get Brexit done. And as someone who campaigned in the 2019 election a few weeks after this PMQs happened, that was the phrase that was repeated back to me most, whereas 2 years previously, I don't think anybody said, do you know what we really need is strong and stable government in the national interest.
One day, Peter, one day. Right, stay with us because we're going to stay in the House of Commons with Jeremy Corbyn, Boris Johnson and John Bercow. You're listening to PMQs Unpacked here on Times Radio.
This winter, enjoy an Antarctic summer with HX Hurtigruten Expeditions. See penguin colonies and humpback whales on this all-inclusive adventure. Save up to 25% when you book selected trips by the 30th of June. Search Travel HX. Conditions apply. Change the way you see the world.
Adam has never been to the Middle East. He's never seen military service. And yet he is a victim of the Iraq War. Adam is 12 years old, but he suffers as a result of his dad's outbursts. Isolation, anger, still in evidence years after he served in Iraq. For many, the battle continues. That's why Combat Stress has developed unique treatments for veterans suffering from PTSD. and a family support service. Combat Stress, for veterans' mental health. To find out more, go to combatstress.org.uk.
The Story, the award-winning daily news podcast from The Times. Listen in the Times Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Times Radio.
Yes, you're listening to classic PMQs Unpacked with me, Patrick Maguire, here on Times Radio. We're taking you back to 2019. Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn facing off in a pre-election PMQs in October 5 years ago. So we're going to head back to the chamber for Jeremy Corbyn's third question.
Mr. Speaker, not for the first time that Prime Minister's talking nonsense. Of course we need to import medicines from various places. I just want it to be done in an open and transparent way. I don't want secret talks between government officials on behalf of ministers with big pharma corporations in the USA. And last year, Mr. Speaker, 34,000 cancer patients waited more than 2 months for treatment. And whilst early detection is obviously very important, the longer people wait, the less chance there is of survival from cancer. The Prime Minister knows that, I know that, the whole world knows that. Why can't he get it and put the necessary resources into the NHS to cut the waiting times?
Right.
If he could just be patient for 30 seconds. He says, Mr. Speaker, he claims, Mr. Speaker, the NHS is safe in his hands. Why then has NHS privatisation doubled under this government, with nearly £10 billion being spent on private companies within our NHS?
Mr. Speaker, the NHS is receiving unrivaled and unprecedented sums of taxpayers' money. But if he is seriously saying that he would not like dentists and opticians and Macmillan care nurses to work with the NHS, then I think he frankly must be out of his mind, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him that cancer survival rates have actually increased year on year since 2010. Cancer survival rates have increased, and more and more people are seen within the right waiting time, thanks to the investments that we are making. And I think he should pay tribute to the hard work of NHS staff, and he should recognise and stop talking down their incredible achievements. And he should recognise that we intend, if we come back as the next government, we will invest massively in that NHS and take it forward with the funds that we will make available from a strong and growing economy. And the reality is that he would wreck that economy.
It's interesting listening to that sort of peroration now, Peter, given that this is the day Labour are promising to clear a record NHS waiting list backlog. The economy is a defining theme of this election. The Conservatives blamed for its stuttering performance. I mean, you really get a sense, listening to that, of the sort of thwarted promise of the last Parliament, don't you?
Yes, indeed. And also the fact that how much things have changed. I mean, Wes Streeting today, he's actually talking with Keir Starmer as we speak about the private sector being involved in the NHS to a greater extent. I mean, Labour were criticised to a huge degree over the failure of, the many, many problems, I should say, of PFI. But certainly where we are now is just so incredibly different. And it just, even the language that Corbyn is using there about, big pharma in the United States, you can hear the contempt kind of dripping for that. Whereas I just think a lot of people listening would just think, well, why are we worried about this? Why is more drugs for people and better deals for people in the NHS necessarily a bad thing? So yeah, I think, as you correctly said earlier, it was the mouse that roared in that, or the dog that didn't bark. Apologies, in that campaign.
The mouse that roared. I prefer the mouse that roared. Yeah, Gitto, you listening to that, you must think, what could have been had Boris Johnson not faced, COVID, this number of self-inflicted things, and a very sort of skittish and let's just say impatient parliamentary party. He had big ambitions for the last 5 years, and here we are watching Rishi Sunak struggling to win an election.
Yeah, and it's a reminder in the end that, there were truly exceptional, global circumstances that came and hit us all, out of the blue and, out of, in time. I think historians will look back and think Britain were the first to get a vaccine. He was a prime minister that put certain things in place that helped deliver that. But at this point in time, when people think COVID, the word association is with Partygate, and therefore, he's gone. But I can't help thinking, listening back to that, just imagine if he'd been told that actually the economy could handle what the COVID bill was, 400 billion. What Boris would have done with 400 billion to invest in public infrastructure, there would have been roads and railways and nuclear power stations and all kinds of things like that everywhere. Now, of course, nobody was saying 400 billion was available, and that's why we're in deep trouble at the moment, because it wasn't really. We've got to pay back the bill for a long time yet. But the ambition there to actually deliver something with lasting impact to the country. Nobody in this election is offering that. There's no great ambition that things will be much better. We're talking about one other nuclear power station by 2050 under this government, and Labour are even more obscure about what their commitments are. So it's very depressing to hear that sense of ambition gone from the heart of British politics.
Well, Gitto Harry, former head of communications at Number 10 under Boris Johnson and Talk TV's Peter Cardwell,